Case 1. The girl who went back for her umbrella. It was Good Friday, April 1st, 1988, in Fort Wayne, Indiana. An 8-year-old girl, a second grader who sang in her church choir and never met a stranger, ran back outside during play to grab her umbrella. She never made it back inside. A quiet, withdrawn man from nearby Grable, Indiana, pulled her into his truck. What happened next would haunt this small Indiana community for 3 decades. Her body was found days later in a rural ditch. Investigators recovered a single shoe and a handful of other items left behind at the scene. Small clues that would sit in evidence storage for years with nowhere to go. But the killer wasn't finished. 2 years later, in 1990, he scrawled a taunting message on the side of a barn, a written boast daring police to catch him. Then, 14 years after that, in 2004, he escalated again. Bags began turning up on bicycles and mailboxes around Fort Wayne, each one containing photographs, used condoms, and a note warning a young girl that she was being watched, that she could be next. It was signed, in essence, by the same hand that had taken a child's life 16 years earlier. Lab testing confirmed the horrifying truth. The DNA on those condoms matched evidence from 1988. Investigators finally had their killer's genetic fingerprint. What they didn't have was a name. A behavioral profile from the FBI described a local man, likely in his 40s or 50s, living a low-income, isolated life somewhere in the area. And for 14 more years, that's all anyone had. Then in 2018, everything changed. Detectives sent the unknown DNA profile to a genetic genealogy lab, which uploaded it to a public ancestry database. Distant cousins started appearing on a family tree, and that tree pointed straight at 2 brothers. Investigators quietly began watching one of them, collecting his discarded trash. The DNA on a thrown-away condom was a perfect match. When officers arrested 64-year-old John D. Miller in July 2018, he didn't deny it. He said the little girl's name before they'd even finished reading him his rights, and admitted he'd been planning to grab a child that day. She simply happened to be the one who came back outside. Miller pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 80 years. He would die behind bars of natural causes in September 2025 at age 66. His own brother later saying publicly that he deserved every day of it. For 30 years, this community lived beside a man who had once scrawled his crimes onto a barn wall for the world to see, never guessing genetic genealogy would one day do what decades of detective work couldn't. Before we continue, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next case file from Daily Crime Archive. Let's continue. Case 2. The Valentine's Dance. Fort Worth, Texas. February 1974. A 17-year-old cheerleader left her high school's Valentine's dance with her boyfriend and stopped at a bowling alley parking lot. A man in his early 30s, a truck driver named Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr., approached the car, knocked her boyfriend unconscious, and dragged her away. In the chaos, he dropped the magazine from his pistol at the scene, a small piece of physical evidence that would end up meaning everything decades later. Over the following 2 days, McCurley kept her captive, using morphine to keep her subdued before ultimately taking her life. Her body was found in a drainage culvert near a nearby lake. When police questioned McCurley about the drop gun magazine, he simply claimed someone had stolen the weapon from him, and, astonishingly, he passed a polygraph test. Suspicion drifted elsewhere. The case went cold for nearly half a century. In 2020, a forensic lab, with funding tied to a true crime documentary series, took another look at degraded DNA recovered from the victim's clothing decades earlier. Against long odds, they built a usable genetic profile and ran it through genealogy databases. It led investigators, once again, to family members, and those family members led straight back to McCurley. Trash pulled from his home, combined with a cheek swab, sealed the match. He was arrested in September 2020, 77 years old, charged with capital murder. During his 2021 trial, prosecutors produced the very pistol he'd kept hidden in his home for over 45 years. Midway through, McCurley changed his plea to guilty, later telling a reporter he'd simply had enough. He received life without parole and died in prison in 2023. This case would go on to inspire federal legislation funding forensic genealogy work on cold cases nationwide, proof that a single dropped gun magazine, held on by investigators for 46 years, could still put a killer behind bars. Quick note, if these stories are hitting different, drop a comment telling us which case surprised you most. It genuinely helps this channel, Daily Crime Archive, reach more people who care about these cases the way you do. Case 3, 0.12 nanograms. Vancouver, Washington, November 1989. A 25-year-old dental assistant living alone never showed up for work. A coworker went to check on her and made a devastating discovery in her apartment. She had been attacked in her own bedroom. Investigators quietly suspected a link to a nearly identical case from 1986 involving another young woman in the same area. But 1989 forensic science had no way to prove it. The biological evidence collected from her clothing was almost unusably small, just 0.12 nanograms, a fraction most labs wouldn't even attempt to test. It sat in storage for 30 years. By the late 2010s, a specialized forensic genome lab had developed techniques capable of building a full genetic profile from practically nothing. What they pulled from that decades-old sample was, at the time, a record-low amount of DNA ever used to solve a case. Uploaded to a genealogy database, it led to the family tree of a man named Darren Roy Marchand, a man of French-Canadian descent, which helped narrow the search considerably. There was just one problem. Marchand, who had in fact been a suspect in that 1986 case all along, had taken his own life back in 1995, 6 years after the 1989 attack, at just 31 years old. He died having never been questioned about either case. In 2019, 30 years after her death, investigators finally connected the dots. There would be no trial, no confession, only certainty delivered 30 years too late that science had finally named the man responsible. Case 4, the original Night Stalker. Across the 1970s and into the mid-1980s, an unidentified man terrorized communities throughout California, breaking into homes, often targeting couples, disappearing into the dark before dawn. He went by several names in the press over the years, and law enforcement would eventually connect him to more than a dozen deaths and over 50 other violent crimes spanning 5 counties. On May 1st, 1986, an 18-year-old woman was house-sitting for a family in Irvine, California, when he broke in. She would become the last confirmed victim in his years-long spree. He had a habit of surveilling homes in advance, sometimes phoning victims or investigators afterward, occasionally referencing a woman named Bonnie, later identified as an ex-fiancée from his past. DNA linked his earlier and later crimes by the late 1990s, but the profile matched no one on file. The case sat unsolved for another 2 decades, spanning jurisdictions that hadn't even realized, at first, they were hunting the same man. Then, in April 2018, a genealogist working with investigators uploaded the killer's DNA profile to a public ancestry site. Distant relatives appeared. A constructed family tree pointed to a 72-year-old former police officer living quietly in Citrus Heights, a man who had actually served on a local force in the 1970s before being fired for shoplifting and who had served in the Navy during Vietnam. He was married, with 3 adult daughters who had no idea about any of it. Detectives collected DNA from his car door handle and his trash. It matched. He was arrested in April 2018. During questioning, he reportedly spoke in different voices, including one he called Jerry, through which he made incriminating statements. In 2020, he pleaded guilty to 13 counts of murder and dozens of additional charges, receiving life without parole to avoid a possible death sentence. He remains incarcerated today in protective custody. Victims' families who had waited over 3 decades for this moment were finally able to speak directly to him in court. Case 5. The letter he couldn't resist sending. Hamburg, Pennsylvania, March 1988. A 39-year-old mother was found dead inside her own home by concerned relatives. There was no obvious motive, no clear suspect, and investigators eventually ran out of leads. 2 years later, in 1990, a local newspaper received an anonymous letter describing details of her death that only her killer could have known. It read like a taunt, proud, almost gleeful. Whoever sent it had licked the envelope to seal it, leaving behind a trace of saliva. Investigators kept the letter, understanding its value even though the science to use it didn't exist yet. Decades later, that science finally arrived. In the early 2020s, state police sent the old letter to a genetic genealogy lab, which extracted a usable DNA profile from the dried saliva on the seal. It led to a family tree, and to a lifelong resident of Hamburg named Scott Grimm, a man with a documented history of sending disturbing, harassing letters to others, including an arrest for similar behavior in 2002. When his DNA was compared to evidence collected from the victim in 1988, it matched. But Grimm had died in 2018 of natural causes, for years before investigators ever connected his name to the case. He'd lived his whole life in the same small town where he'd committed the crime. His own need to boast about it, in writing, ultimately becoming the very evidence used to identify him in 2022, 34 years later. Case 6. The Neighbor on the Stairs. Sacramento, California, October 1970. A 27-year-old legal secretary came home from work and was attacked in her apartment with a knife pulled from her own kitchen. She fought hard. Investigators found clear signs of struggle, along with something unusual, blood at the scene that didn't belong to her. Her attacker had been cut during the fight and left his own blood behind, mixed with hers. Without DNA testing in 1970, that blood evidence simply went into storage while the case went cold. It stayed there for decades, waiting for forensic science to catch up. In 2019, a grant-funded new genetic genealogy work on the case. A lab extracted a usable profile from the old blood sample and uploaded it to a genealogy database, which pointed to relatives of a man named Richard John Davis. As investigators dug deeper, they made a chilling discovery. Davis had lived in the same apartment building as his victim. He likely passed her regularly in the stairwell or hallway. There is no sign the two had ever had a relationship. This appears to have been a crime of opportunity involving someone who lived just feet away. Davis had died in 1997 from complications tied to long-term alcoholism, 22 years before he was ever identified, having spent nearly 3 decades living freely after taking a neighbor's life. If you're new here, welcome to Daily Crime Archive. We post cold case breakdowns like this one regularly, so if you want to catch the next one the moment it drops, now's a good time to subscribe. Case 7. The Monk Who Used to Live Upstairs. Burlington, Vermont, July 1971. A 24-year-old woman who worked as both a teacher and a motel maid was attacked and killed inside her own apartment. She fought back. The scene showed clear signs of a violent struggle. Investigators questioned everyone in the building, including the man who lived in the unit directly above hers. He told police he'd been home with his wife all night. She backed up his story. With nothing to contradict it, detectives moved on. Cigarette butts recovered from the apartment were logged into evidence and forgotten. There was no DNA testing in 1971 to do anything with them. Not long after, the upstairs neighbor's marriage fell apart. He left Vermont entirely, eventually relocating overseas and becoming a Buddhist monk. In 1986, he died of an overdose at age 43, decades before anyone would connect him to the case. In 2014, those old cigarette butts were finally tested, producing a DNA profile of an unknown man. By 2019, genealogy tools had advanced enough to trace that profile to his family, and eventually, through a DNA sample from his half-brother, back to him directly. What investigators learned afterward was disturbing. He had a documented history of sudden, unprovoked violence, including stabbing a friend without warning and attempting to choke his own wife. On the night of the killing, the two had reportedly argued before he left their apartment and went downstairs. His wife's false alibi had protected him completely, allowing him to walk free for the rest of his life. The case was officially closed in February 2023, 52 years after it began. Case 8. A welfare check. Portsmouth, New Hampshire, September 1981. A 23-year-old beauty school student was last seen heading home for the night, seemingly in good spirits. The next afternoon, a police officer arrived at her apartment to serve an unrelated legal summons. When no one answered, he let himself in to check on her and found her body inside. She'd been struck with a heavy object and restrained with cords found in her own apartment. A glass bottle recovered at the scene was believed to be the weapon. Whoever did this left no ID and appeared to have picked her at random. DNA testing in 1981 simply wasn't capable of building a profile from what little evidence existed, and the case stalled for good. For decades later, forensic labs could finally extract usable genetic material from evidence that old. In 2022, a state Justice Department partnered with a genealogy lab, developed a profile, and matched it to the family of a man named Ronnie James Lee, a 21-year-old Army veteran with an extensive criminal record, living in Portsmouth at the time. A cigarette, but collected from the original scene, confirmed the match. Lee had died in 2005 from a substance-related incident at age 45, having lived 24 more years without ever being tied to the case. In July 2023, the state's Attorney General announced the resolution. 42 years after a routine welfare check had led an officer straight into one of the coldest cases in the state's history. Case 9. The Jane Doe of Lake Tahoe. In July 1982, hikers near Lake Tahoe, California, found the remains of a woman who had been shot. She carried no ID, matched no missing person reports, and was logged simply as a Jane Doe, one of thousands of unidentified victims sitting in cold case files across the country. Her fingerprints matched nothing. For 36 years, she had no name at all. In 2018, a nonprofit dedicated to identifying unknown deceased people took on her case, using DNA pulled from her remains to build a family tree through public genealogy databases. It led them to her identity, Mary Edith Silvani, 33 years old at the time of her death. She had endured serious personal hardship, lost stable housing, and drifted out of contact with relatives who might otherwise have reported her missing, which explained why no one had ever come looking. With her name finally restored, investigators turned to the second half of the mystery. Who had taken her life? DNA recovered from her body decades earlier belonged to an unknown man. The same genealogy techniques that had identified her led investigators to James Richard Curry, a man from Texas with a history of serious crime, including robbery, and links to other similar attacks. Curry had confessed to additional offenses before taking his own life in custody in 1983, just 1 year after killing Silvani, and long before anyone connected him to her case. This resolution marked a genuine first. The same investigation identified both an unnamed victim and her unidentified killer using the same emerging science, giving Silvani her name back after 37 years, even though her killer would never face a courtroom. Case
that two separate incidents spanning 5 years shared a common perpetrator. Diane Olkwitz and Terry Erdman. On November 3, 1966, 19-year-old Diane Olkwitz arrived for her shift at the Kenworth Trucking Facility in Menomonee Falls, Wisconsin. Olkwitz worked as a secretary and was known as a warm and caring individual by her colleagues and family. When she failed to return home that evening, family members contacted authorities and a search of the facility was conducted. Olkwitz was found deceased inside the building, having sustained more than 100 stab wounds. The extensive nature of the attack suggested extreme rage or psychological disturbance on the part of the perpetrator. Medical examination confirmed that the attack had not included certain other elements, indicating the primary motive may have been tied to anger or opportunity rather than other factors. The investigation in 1966 identified no clear suspects. Olkwitz had no known conflicts, and co-workers reported nothing unusual in the days leading to her demise. The case grew cold despite the preservation of physical evidence from the scene. 5 years later, on June 24, 1971, The body of 15-year-old Terry Erdman was discovered in a field in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Erdman had been stabbed approximately 60 times, and her body had been partially disrobed. The brutality of the attack and certain circumstantial details led some investigators to wonder if there might be a connection to other unsolved cases, but without concrete evidence, this remained speculation. Both crime scenes were located within 2 miles of each other, though this proximity was not initially recognized as significant. The cases were investigated separately, and decades passed with both remaining unsolved. Families of both victims continued to seek answers as years stretched into decades. The breakthrough came in the 2020s through advances in DNA sequencing and genetic genealogy. In 2021, Othram, Inc. was able to extract and sequence DNA from evidence collected at both crime scenes decades earlier. The DNA from Olkwitz's case came from items at the scene, while Erdman's case yielded DNA from biological evidence on her body. Analysis revealed that the DNA profiles from both cases matched each other, confirming that the same person was responsible for both attacks. This was a significant development, linking 2 cases that had been investigated independently for more than 50 years. The combined profile was then uploaded to genealogy databases for familial matching. The genetic genealogy analysis, conducted with FBI assistance, identified relatives of a man named Clarence Marcus Tappendorf. Tappendorf had worked as a truck driver and was familiar with the areas where both incidents occurred. His occupation and local knowledge would have given him access to the Kenworth facility where Olkwitz worked and familiarity with the routes near where Erdman was found. Tappendorf had died in 2008 at the age of 80, never having been connected to either case during his lifetime. To confirm the genetic genealogy findings, authorities obtained court approval to exhume Tappendorf's remains. DNA extracted from his body definitively matched the profiles from both crime scenes. The announcement of the resolution came in 2023, more than 50 years after both incidents. Olkwitz's sister Debbie spoke of her sister's caring nature and the family's long wait for answers. The shocking revelation that the same person had committed both attacks, separated by 5 years and targeting victims of different ages and circumstances, raised questions about Tappendorf's activities during the years between and whether there might have been additional victims who were never connected to him. The final case would be resolved in the most dramatic fashion, involving a standoff that ended the perpetrator's life. Deborah Lee Miller. On the morning of April 29, 1981, 18-year-old Deborah Lee Miller was found deceased in her apartment in Mansfield, Ohio. Miller worked as a waitress and lived in a modest apartment building. She had been attacked with items from her own kitchen, including an oven grate and cooking pots, sustaining severe trauma before her life was taken. The crime scene suggested someone had entered Miller's apartment with harmful intent. There were no signs of forced entry, leading investigators to theorize that Miller may have known her attacker, or that the perpetrator had gained access through an unlocked door. The brutality of the attack, using improvised weapons found in the residence, painted a picture of rage or opportunity, rather than premeditation. Investigators conducted extensive interviews with building residents, including James Van Est, who lived in the apartment directly above Miller's unit. Van Est provided statements about his whereabouts and claimed to have no knowledge of the incident. Without evidence to contradict his account and lacking DNA technology to analyze biological evidence from the scene, the case eventually went cold. Evidence was preserved according to 1981 protocols, and the case file remained open but inactive for decades. Periodic reviews by cold case detectives found no new leads using conventional investigative methods. By 2021, Advances in DNA technology made it possible to analyze complex mixed profiles that would have been unusable in earlier decades. Forensic scientists were able to extract and separate multiple DNA profiles from evidence collected at Miller's apartment in 1981. One of these profiles belonged to an unknown male who was not Miller or any of the individuals who had been ruled out during the original investigation. This profile was suitable for genetic genealogy analysis. When uploaded to genealogy databases and analyzed, it led investigators back to James Van Est, the upstairs neighbor who had been interviewed 40 years earlier. Further investigation revealed inconsistencies between Van Est's 1981 statements and the physical evidence. In 2024, investigators approached Van Est for a follow-up interview. During this conversation, detectives presented him with information about the DNA evidence and the inconsistencies in his previous statements. Following this interview, Van Est fled the area. On November 18, 2024, law enforcement located Van Est and attempted to take him into custody. A standoff ensued during which an officer was wounded. The confrontation ended when Van Est was fatally shot. His death occurred before he could be formally charged with Miller's demise, though the DNA evidence had definitively connected him to the crime scene. Detective Terry Butler stated that Van Est likely sensed the investigation was closing in on him after the 2024 interview, prompting his flight and the eventual confrontation. Van Est had also been facing unrelated federal charges at the time of his death, adding additional pressure. The resolution of Miller's case came 43 years after her passing. The revelation that her upstairs neighbor had been responsible all along, providing false information to investigators in 1981 and living in the same building where he had committed the offense, echoed patterns seen in other cases where proximity and opportunity had enabled perpetrators to remain undetected for decades. For Miller's family, the identification brought closure, but also the difficult knowledge that justice had come only through Van Est's death rather than through trial and formal accountability. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.
10. The apartment with no sign of forced entry. Mansfield, Ohio, April 1981. An 18-year-old waitress was found dead in her apartment, killed with household items, an oven grate and cooking pots pulled from her own kitchen. There was no forced entry, which led investigators to believe she may have known her attacker or simply hadn't locked her door that night. Detectives interviewed everyone in the building, including the man living directly above her, who claimed to know nothing about it. Without contradicting evidence, and without DNA testing available in 1981, the case went cold and stayed that way for 40 years. By 2021, forensic labs had developed the ability to separate multiple contributors from a single mixed DNA sample, technology that simply hadn't existed before. Scientists pulled an unknown male profile from evidence at the scene, ran it through a genealogy database, and landed right back on the same upstairs neighbor who'd been interviewed in 1981. His original statements no longer lined up with the physical evidence. In 2024, investigators sat him down again, this time with the DNA results in hand. Shortly afterward, he fled. Police eventually located him. A standoff followed, during which an officer was wounded before the man was fatally shot. He died before he could ever be formally charged. The DNA evidence stood in for a trial that would never happen. Detectives later said he had clearly sensed the investigation closing in after that final interview. For the victim's family, the case closed 43 years later, answers arriving not through a courtroom, but through his death. 10 different decades, 10 different states, and every single case cracked open by the same quiet revolution. Genetic genealogy turning the smallest, most forgotten pieces of evidence into a killer's name. If you want more cases like these broken down the same way, subscribe to Daily Crime Archive and turn on notifications, because we're just getting started. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.